Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for another Discover Wildlife evening. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Dan Free, and I'm the General Manager here at Wildlife Worldwide and Travelling Naturalist. Now, tonight I'm joined by Chris Breen, the founder of Wildlife Worldwide, and Chris is going to be talking to us about polar voyages. It's a subject that he knows extremely well. I can vouch for the fact that he's been on plenty of these trips over the last, well, not so much the last year or two, but prior to that, certainly the few years that I've been at the company. Before that, Chris was on these trips very regularly. And I can think of few people in the industry better placed to give this talk tonight. Now, as ever, there will be an opportunity to ask questions through the evening. So we'd just kindly ask that you post them either in the chat forum or in the Q&A forum. And we'll endeavour to either answer those as we're going along or at the end of the evening when I will put some of those questions to Chris. We will be featuring a few of the trips which we offer tonight, and again, they will be available at the end of the evening should you require any more information on them. So they will be presented as a poll and you'll be able to select the trip of interest, and we will send you details hopefully in the next day or two. Now, I won't waffle on too much longer. I don't know if you're good to go, Chris.
Yes, very happy to. Yeah, you've probably seen me drinking my can of Coke just to loosen my throat up. Yeah, so no, very happy to crack on. Absolutely, no problem.
Good man. Okay, I'll pass it across to you and speak to you in a bit. Cheers, Chris. Good. All the best.
So lovely to see everybody again. As you will have heard me say on a number of occasions in the past, though generally speaking, it's somebody else doing the presenting rather than me, much though I enjoy it. So this evening, I'm going to chat to you about polar voyages, and particularly three key areas in the world. One of them is the Southern Ocean, that is particularly Falklands, South Georgia and Antarctica. The second area is Wrangel Island, which is up in the Russian Far East. And the third area that I'm going to talk to you about is Svalbard, or Spitsbergen, which is in the Norwegian Arctic. We're very particular at Wildlife Worldwide about the polar voyages that we offer, and we've been offering them for many years now, both in the Antarctic and also in the Arctic. Sometimes we charter ships, sometimes we charter half a ship, and on many occasions we are working with ships and selling into their offerings. And if you were to speak to any of our sales team at the moment, and I suspect you have and no doubt will in the coming weeks and days, they'll tell you that there are some really super offers on at the moment. Not entirely surprising, of course, because of the COVID era, but there are some really offers on for some lovely voyages to some really wonderful parts of the globe, wonderful parts of the polar regions. So for us, polar voyages, wait a minute, that's that horrible sound that always comes when Nick Garbutt does a presentation. There we are, that's better. So for us, it's all about small ships and a small ship experience. And a small ship for us is a ship that accommodates anywhere between 100 and 150 people. Anything more than that for us really is too many. This particular vessel is a vessel called the Spirit of Enderby. A number of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with it. It's a vessel that we use when we go to Wrangel Island up in the Arctic. Small ships are great because they offer a nice, intimate and a more personal experience. They're also able to get to more places. And for example, in places like Antarctica, there are different rules and regulations for ships that carry fewer than 200 passengers, that is to say 199 passengers or fewer, and ships that carry 499 passengers or fewer, and then 500 and above. Needless to say, the ships with the with a lower number of passengers, are able to get to more places. The smaller the ships tend to be, the greater the access you have in and around the ship. 24-hour access to the outdoor decks, depending, of course, on where you are and what the weather conditions are like. But 24-hour access to the outdoor areas of the ship is wonderful. This, for example, was taken, I think, at about 2:30 in the morning up in the Arctic. I was with Joe Cornish. We were who is a wonderful landscape photographer, as I'm sure many of you know. And we were up this was on one of our Wrangel Island expeditions, but the light, as you can see here, was quite extraordinary, really quite beautiful. And it was actually very difficult to even think about the possibility of going to bed because it was so fantastic. Again, on small ships, being out on deck is very important, especially when there's great wildlife to see. I'm just going to attempt something here. With any luck, you should be able to see my mouse now, but there, albeit distant for us at that particular point in time, but there, if you can see that, that's a polar bear. In this particular photograph, it's just simply a blob, but it really is a polar bear. So the small ships, oops, it's not working. There we go. So the small ships, the expedition ships, generally speaking, have an open bridge policy, which is lovely. That means you can get up, you can be with the expedition team, you can be looking at the maps, you can be scanning for wildlife, and you can be seeing how the whole operation works, which is lovely. It's very enjoyable. It's an added dimension to trips like this. The dining experience is always pretty good too. I fully appreciate that isn't probably the reason why you're going to be going on one of these trips, but it is nice if the food is good and the dining experience is good. This is on board Quark Expeditions Ocean Adventurer, which we use in Antarctica, and we've also chartered for our Festival of Wildlife trip in June 2022. But the dining experience is very good on pretty much all of these vessels, which is very, very nice. A specialist onboard team is crucially important, and on all the ships that we work with, there's an absolutely outstanding onboard team, which will include an expedition leader. It will include probably mammal experts and marine biologists, just depending on where you are, ornithologists and glaciologists. There may be a photographer, a historian, possibly an artist, and maybe kayak guides as well, just depending on where you go. And depending on the trip, we may well put our own team on board. This is the team of us that have been to the Arctic, been to the Russian Arctic, Wrangel Island, on a number of occasions in the past. Myself, Mark Kawardi and Joe Cornish, Emma from our office, and two others, Katie, who's a historian, and Rachel, who was working with us on the operational aspects of the trip. But a personal experience is far more likely on a smaller ship. And that personal experience extends to having one-to-one or one-to-two tuition. In this case, Joe Cornish was doing one of his photo workshops in Whalebone Alley up in the Russian Far East on our Wrangel Island trip. All of the vessels that we work with have a wonderful onboard lecture program with a comprehensive series of talks and presentations covering a whole range of topics, just depending upon the skills of those on board. In this particular case, we were on Spirit of Enderby, and we had some of the Wrangel Island Rangers on board who were talking to us about their year-round experience, which they began by talking to us about their experience in winter, where, of course, they don't have any daylight at all. It's 24-hour darkness as opposed to 24-hour daylight. and they describe Wrangel Island in winter as having only 3 colours. One is black, one is white, and one is grey. But they're full of smiles, and they clearly love the wildlife, and they love protecting it, which of course is super. On some of the trips that we offer, this was aboard Ocean Adventurer in the Antarctic. There is a kayaking program, and we do the same thing in the Arctic as well. And sometimes there's a hiking program, hiking, oblique walking. Sometimes there's a camping option, etc. When I took this photograph in Antarctica, which now would have been a couple of years ago, we had the most wonderful experience out on the kayaks when it was beautifully silent. We could hear birds and so on, and then suddenly we could hear the breath of a whale, and then we realized it wasn't just one whale, but it was in actual fact 3 rather marvelous and close by minke whales that surfaced near us and then disappeared, and we didn't see them again, but they cruised right past us, and that was very, very special. That's a wonderful experience. And then the real magic, I guess, comes on the expedition voyages when you can get out on Zodiacs. The Zodiacs really offer a new and interesting dimension to cruising, if you like, wildlife cruising, expedition voyages. It's all about getting off the vessel as much as you can. And on the voyages that we offer, you'll generally speaking be off the vessel at least a couple of times every day. And with a good expedition leader on board, and generally speaking, there will be outstanding expedition leaders on board, they'll get you off the ship as many times as they possibly can. This photograph was taken fairly late at night. As you can see, there was a beautiful sunset, and we had an incredible hour or so on the water, looking at birds and I think looking at 1 or 2 whales and so on as well. Launching the Zodiacs is an interesting and fun operation to watch. The teams are incredibly experienced at doing this, so it's all extremely quick and slick. And having the Zodiacs enables us to land in very remote places. In this particular case, we're in a place called Doubtful Harbour on Wrangel Island. And Zodiac cruising can lead to some really wonderful sightings. In this particular case, these are humpback whales off the coast of the Russian Far East. And this was a humpback whale in Antarctica. And this was a Zodiac cruise at about 11 o'clock at night. We saw these polar bears feeding, and it was just too irresistible to stay on board. Of course, we'd had dinner. 1 or 2 people had gone to bed. We roused them, and I think absolutely everybody out onto the Zodiacs. We got to a lower level and were able to take some wonderful photographs of this particular episode, this rather lovely encounter that we had. So what I'm going to do is describe to you these 3 trips in a little bit more detail, and begin with the Southern Ocean, the Falklands, South Georgia and Antarctica. It's worth me mentioning, I think, in the first instance, that I think the Falklands, South Georgia and Antarctica trip, that combination of the 3, really probably is the ultimate Southern Ocean trip. Of course, it's possible to go to Antarctica without going to the Falkland Islands, and indeed without going to South Georgia, but that combination is a particularly interesting one and a particularly exciting one. Those voyages tend to be 16 or 17 days, and they tend to be in November, and sometimes there'll be one in late February or early March. More conventional trips down to Antarctica, which would depart from Ushuaia, which you can see there on the southern tip of South America, and sail across the Drake Passage, and then down to the northern part of the Antarctic Peninsula, they tend to be much shorter trips. And they would typically be 10 days or 9 days, which in each case requires a couple of days sailing across the Drake Passage. For some, that's a wonderful and exciting experience. For others, it's a daunting prospect. I'm lucky enough to have done it a couple of times now, and I found it utterly inspiring. I found it incredible, wonderful, exciting, dramatic, all of the wonderful things you can think to say about going on a voyage. It was absolutely fabulous. I loved it. There are different ways to do it, and we can talk about that. I'll mention that a little bit later. There are longer trips that go down to Antarctica, which actually go down and cross what's called the Antarctic Circle. And they would go down for, you'd be sailing for 14 or 15 nights. There's a lot of fear in some people's minds about going across the Drake Passage because of high seas, which of course there can be, but equally it can be smooth. But it's very exciting, and it's an opportunity to brush up on some wonderful bird watching. It's great for seeing albatrosses and shearwaters and all sorts of interesting, exciting things. It's just an exciting and dramatic experience. If you were going to do the Falklands, South Georgia and Antarctica trip, first of all, you need to fly into the Falklands. You'd fly into Santiago first, and then you'd fly from Santiago down to a place called Punta Arenas in southern Chile, and then you would fly across from Punta Arenas to the Falklands, flying into a place called Mount Pleasant, and then leaving Mount Pleasant by road, which is what I've done here, and then driving about 45 minutes or so in order to get to Stanley, which is where the ship will be waiting. Even the experience of just watching the bags being loaded makes you feel like an expedition is beginning. It's not quite like putting your bag on the carousel at Gatwick Airport or Heathrow. Seeing the bags being hoisted up and onto the ship is an exciting and interesting part of the beginning of the voyage, in my view. It's a couple of days sailing to get to South Georgia. And the first place that you get to in South Georgia, the first sort of landing point, I shall point it out here. The first landing point will be here in King Haakon Bay, on the northwestern side of the island. And then, generally speaking, what would happen is, we'll look at some images of these places in a minute, is that the ship would then come out and sail around, and then basically sail around the north side of the island, popping into various of the interesting bays, and probably ending up as far south as Gold Harbour, just depending on weather conditions, sailing conditions, or perhaps a little bit further south. There are one or two voyages which are South Georgia only voyages. So that would then retrace steps, stopping at one or two places on the way back, and then head back over in a westerly direction to the Falkland Islands. If, on the other hand, you are travelling on down to Antarctica, you would head south from Gold Harbour and carry on down to Antarctica that way. Let me just get rid of that and see if I can then show you. So South Georgia really is probably one of, if not the most incredible places on earth for wildlife. There's really no doubt about it. When it comes to these amazing elephant seals, and also, of course, penguins. And for me, it was all about the penguins. This was Salisbury Plain, not like Salisbury Plain 26 miles away from where I live, but very different. Haven't really got any king penguins on Salisbury Plain here, but this was amazing. Seeing the penguins was for the first time for me was an extraordinary, wonderful, amazing eye-opener. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of penguins all huddled together has got to be one of the most incredible wildlife sites there is to be had anywhere on earth. They're very inquisitive. They are not at all worried about us. They are as interested in us and interested to find out about us, I think, as we are interested in them and interested in finding out about them, which is wonderful. It makes for a very exciting trip. A visit to South Georgia is always punctuated with a visit to Grytviken, which is the ultimate resting place of Sir Ernest Shackleton. And all of the vessels stop at Grytviken, and all of the vessels stop to pay him their respects. In this particular case, the historian on board our vessel, a gentleman here in orange, then read a piece about Sir Ernest Shackleton, and we then toasted him with a glass of whiskey, which is not my tipple of choice, and I suspect not necessarily everybody's. So if you don't want to drink the whiskey, you then pour it on his grave. So I'm completely convinced that he is entirely pickled in whiskey. But it's a wonderful spot and an amazing thing to see. Back on board, of course, there's more amazing wildlife to see, more landscapes to photograph, more birds to see and to identify. As I say, if you were on a South Georgia only voyage, you would then be heading back north and west. If you're heading down to Antarctica, you'd keep on going south on the high seas, which hopefully aren't too high, and hopefully you have some nice clear days like I did on this particular occasion. And there really is some wonderful birding to be had. And this particular bird is a grey-headed albatross, but of course there's also the possibility of seeing whales and shearwaters and other things as well. Once you get down to Antarctica, it becomes very, very still. The waters become very calm and still, and the colours really are quite amazing. And the glaciers are amazing, and the sea is amazing, and everything about it is quite extraordinary. I think it's worth mentioning that there is now another way of getting to Antarctica. If you're not terribly enthusiastic about the high seas, and that is that there are some what are known as fly sail options. So generally speaking, as I mentioned at the beginning, an Antarctic voyage would include a couple of days of crossing the Drake Passage in each direction, a couple of nights of crossing the Drake Passage in each direction. So a 9-night voyage would be a couple of nights just crossing the Drake Passage south, 5 nights voyaging down the Antarctic Peninsula, and then a couple of days crossing the Drake Passage heading back north. You can now still have 5 or 6 days in Antarctica, but you can do that by flying out of Punta Arenas and straight down to Antarctica. It's a different way of doing things. Again, it's not for everybody, but if you are not a confident sailor and you're not confident you'll enjoy the Drake Passage, it might be worth considering. It's not something I've personally done yet, but I am going to experience this in the early part of next year. So if anyone's interested in doing the trip that way, I'll happily report back, because I think it's quite an interesting way of doing it. Antarctica, magnificent colours, beautiful reflections. You need to kind of force yourself to take your camera away from your eyes, because there is so much wonderful stuff to see and so much wonderful stuff to photograph. Leopard seals, these beautiful birds are snowy sheathbills. Again, more wonderful penguins depending on where you are. These are Gentoo penguins. And it's so easy in Antarctica to get up close and personal with these guys. And this, I think, is a shot that perhaps illustrates really what it's like on an Antarctic voyage. Perhaps not the cleanest penguin site, but it's quite interesting. Obviously, I took this photograph and I was on a slightly raised area. I was on a walk. You can see the ship in the background. If you look in the bottom left-hand side of the image, you can see some guys on a Zodiac cruise, and they're coming into land, and I suspect they will be getting off and going for a walk as well. And there's a whole group of kayakers too. And we're looking out over the ocean. Slightly murky sky on this occasion, but there's lots of lovely penguins, and there's a research station in the background. But it's really quite a classic Antarctic picture. The colours, as I mentioned, and the skies in Antarctica are exceptional. I found the skyscapes really quite amazing. And the colours too, just utterly beautiful. All different colours, from blues and oranges and greys to reds and pinks. It's a photographer's dream and an artist's dream, I would say. And there's always penguins doing something, or seals doing something, or there's always something to see in the ocean. Dan very, very generously said that I've done these sorts of things a number of times. I am lucky enough to have done these sorts of things a number of times, though I still consider myself to be a relative newcomer. I love it. I find it incredibly exciting and fulfilling, invigorating going to these places, particularly going to the polar regions, and I would highly recommend it. I mentioned I'm going to Antarctica to do one of the fly sail trips, which I am doing, and I'm doing that in the middle of January. As I was looking at my photographs today, in sort of preparing this talk, I really was wondering if there is anything at all that can prepare you for the extraordinary beauty of the polar regions. And I think the answer to that really is no. I became very enthusiastic about it all again, particularly the polar regions, when I was reviewing my images to show you this evening. So it's really wonderful. So we're going to the opposite end of the earth now. And I'm going to use my pointer again and show you where we're heading for now. We're now heading for this place here, this little blob on the northeastern side of Russia. This is Wrangel Island. And in order to get to Wrangel Island, we first of all fly from the UK into Moscow, and then we fly from Moscow right the way across Russia. We fly on one of the Russian airlines, which we feel quite comfortable about, even though the flight itself is always very busy, and I'm afraid to say the food isn't particularly good. But they always get us to where we need to be. It's quite a noisy flight, purely and simply because it's always very, very full. And we end up here in a place called Anadyr. And from Anadyr, we then board our ship. The ship that we charter in this part of the world is the Spirit of Enderby, which I showed you previously. It's a lovely ship. We've become very fond of it. It's quite an old vessel. It can only accommodate 54 people. And it's absolutely oozing with character, with a fantastic team on board and with tremendous food. And of course, we go to a really lovely part of the world on board. When we arrive in Anadyr, the very first thing we see, albeit that we're utterly exhausted after a long flight, but the very first thing we see is beluga whales. So far. Of course, it's wildlife, so maybe that won't be the case next time, but so far so good. We see beluga whales, and we see a lot of them. And they're all feeding on salmon in the nearby river. And this is our route, the route that we take. So we board in Anadyr, and then we come out. We go across Anadyrsky Bay we go across to Itigren and Nuneaton Islands. We go up to Lavrenthia, to Cape Dejnev, Koliuchin Island, and then we head north up to Wrangel and Herald Island. And depending on what the weather conditions are, we will either go to Herald first or we'll go to Wrangel first. And we'll either go in a clockwise direction or an anti-clockwise direction. Very much depends on weather conditions and snow conditions. On board, it's an opportunity to practice a bit of bird photography. Northern fulmars are generally speaking following the ship, and the place where things really start hotting up is in a place called Preobrazhenia Bay. And if we're lucky enough in Preobrazhenia Bay, we should see Kamchatka brown bear. We've seen them every trip so far. They're quite skittish, they're still hunted, but they are really magnificent things to see. We head on up and we go to a place called Whalebone Alley, which is a World Heritage Site. It's probably the most remote and I suspect the least visited World Heritage Site on Earth. We regularly see grey whales here. Generally their presence is given away by the sound of their blows. And as well as their flukes, and we sometimes see humpbacks up here too. And these are the jawbones of bowhead whales, which have been here for a few hundred years. No one quite knows whether this is a sacred and ceremonial site or whether it's simply a place for people to gather and to feast and to trade. But it sits on a major whale migration route, so the chances are that its function was related to the annual spring and autumn migration of the whales. Whatever it was, it's an impressive place, and it's a tremendous place to visit. As you can imagine, meeting the locals is always an important thing for us too, and we go to one or two very interesting cultural sites. And when we get to Wrangel Island, we stand a very good chance of seeing muskoxen, which were here originally. They died out, but they were then subsequently reintroduced many years ago, but we should stand a good chance of seeing muskoxen. Wrangel was the last place on Earth where mammoths lived. Woolly mammoths were here until about 3,500 years ago, and there's lots of evidence of woolly mammoths. And the national parks people are very happy for visitors to interact with woolly mammoth artifacts, and this is actually a woolly mammoth tusk, unbelievably heavy, as you can imagine, and it's quite a lengthy tusk as well, but very interesting to see and nice to be able to handle these things. 24-hour daylight, interesting cloudscapes, of course, and we make the most of all available opportunities to land on Wrangel Island. We spend nearly 6 days here in the immediate vicinity of the island. We may well see snow geese. There is a site where the snow geese are in fairly large numbers. We can't get that close to them because they are actually in molt, and at that point they can't fly. So obviously we don't want to disturb them, but we do generally see them. This particular area is, or the seas around Wrangel Island, is where the grey whales come to feed. And these are the grey whales that we would, generally speaking, be looking at when we do our voyages down the Baja Peninsula, down into Mexico. They don't feed when they're down in Mexico, they're only feeding when they're up here. So it's very, very exciting to see the grey whales, some of which we will have seen down south, up here in the Chukchi Sea. So it's exciting, and it always feels quite special when we see the grey whales. Walruses as well, in big numbers. Again, sometimes we see them in big numbers, sometimes we don't. We generally see good populations of walrus. In this particular on this particular sighting, there were 3 different groups, each of which had hundreds of walrus in it, and we estimated there was probably somewhere between 800 and 1,000 walrus. We've also had some fantastic sightings of bowhead whales up here. Haven't got any images of bowhead whales in here, unfortunately. But we had a fantastic sighting of bowhead whales when we were up here last, which of course wasn't last year because of COVID, it was the year before. When we had a bowhead whale, which Mark Cowardian estimated as being probably between 150 and 200 years old, just because of the colouring of the face. The face gets whiter and whiter as it gets older and older. But from the top of our ship, we were standing in a nice prominent position at the top, actually we were looking at walruses in the ocean. And we then caught sight of a bowhead whale, which swam underneath the bow of the ship from the port side, underneath the bow of the ship, and then came up under the starboard side, which is another wonderful sighting. But our Wrangel Island voyage is also all about polar bears, and it's where we stand a fabulous chance of seeing polar bears, and in really good numbers too. Wrangel and Herald Islands are known to be very important denning sites for the polar bears. These two cubs, together with their mum, we saw from a considerable distance away. It was probably a mile or more. But they were intrigued by us. And of course, we were going to approach reasonably closely towards the bears, certainly closer than a mile anyway. But we got to a certain point and they kept on coming. And it's amazing to be able to almost sort of sneak up, in inverted commas, to within a few meters, relatively speaking, on polar bears. In a great big ship, it seems amazing, really. Sometimes you can get very close to the polar bears when you're on board a ship. They might be asleep on an ice floe and they won't even wake up. On our previous visits to Wrangel Island, we've had 30 or more polar bear encounters on each occasion. Some of these encounters really being quite amazing encounters. And being able to get very close to polar bears on a ship is a rather wonderful experience. But I'm going to drag you away from Wrangel Island, but I'm still going to keep you in the Arctic, and I'm going to drag you away now to Spitsbergen, to Svalbard, which is where we are running our Festival of Wildlife at the end of June in 2022. Of course, it should have been last year, but sadly it wasn't to be, but it's going to be in end of June in 2022, and we're very excited about it. In order to get to Svalbard, which you can see at the top of your screen there, you fly into a place called Longyearbyen, and as you walk out of the airport, you are greeted by a polar bear. It's a polar bear on a sign, but I find it quite a comforting image. It's always very nice to see a polar bear on a sign. It means that they must be around. And this is a map of the Svalbard archipelago. So Svalbard, the whole archipelago, is sometimes erroneously referred to as Spitsbergen. It's the archipelago that's Spitsbergen. It's the archipelago that's Svalbard, and Spitsbergen is the big island which you can see there on the western side. So, having boarded the ship, you will probably, as we will be doing on our voyage, I shall again just sort of point this out to you with my mouse. So Longyearbyen is here, and on our voyage, what we will be doing almost certainly is we will be, in the first instance, we'll be heading north, and this may well be one of our first stops, this place called Ny-Ålesund, and we will probably head as far north as Fuglesången, but that again will partly depend on weather conditions and ice conditions, because ice conditions are very important when it comes to seeing polar bears, as you can imagine. I'm also going to point out to you this place here called Hornsund, which will become more relevant a little bit later on. So having boarded the ship, you head out of Longyearbyen, and heading out of Longyearbyen, there was a very good opportunity to see whales. Could well be minke whales or orcas, possibly humpbacks, or as in this case, blue whales. And again, as with going to Antarctica or the Arctic, the Russian Far East, to be fair, many voyages, it's a good opportunity to practice some bird photography. And as with the trip to Wrangel Island, this is another shot of a northern fulmar. They seem to be particularly partial to the back of the boats, and it's wonderful because they tend to fly at eye level. So it's a good way to practice a bit of bird photography en route. It may also provide, or rather I should say, Spitsbergen may well provide an opportunity to for your first sighting of some really big glaciers, which is wonderful. The glaciers and the colours and the landscape generally is really quite beautiful. Birds play an important role in these trips, and in the Arctic particularly, I would say. This is a long-tailed skua, and it's also possible to see parasitic skua and possibly Pomerine skua. Other lovely things like common eiders and black guillemots, pigeon guillemots are also a possibility, and little auks as well. All beautiful, beautiful Arctic birds, and all in plenty. And we go to some wonderful bird cliffs, and I'll show you a couple of shots a little bit later on. But we go to some wonderful bird cliffs where we have great opportunities to see these things in very big numbers. So in the case of the trip that I was doing, and in the case of our Festival of Wildlife trip, heading north to Ny-Ålesund, and passing some amazing scenery along the way, beautiful crystal clear skies, of course, and having the opportunity to get off the vessel and head to shore by Zodiac, each of the Zodiacs accommodating approximately 10 people. This particular stop wasn't, in this case, particularly a wildlife stop. There was some very interesting stuff to see. This is quite common but pretty purple saxifrage, but also snow goose nest without snow goose on it in this particular case. And when we land in Svalbard, we're always with a guide, and all of the guides are armed just in case of polar bears. All the guides are absolutely fantastic. This is a guide called Annie, who's really super. So we'll head north, and on the trip I did, we were heading north to the furthest regions of Svalbard. There's always interesting things to see. There's always interesting photographs to take. In this particular case, I was actually photographing the polar bear footprints, but I then realized you could actually see the name of the ship mirrored in the water, and I thought that was quite nice. And then, of course, you look in the other direction, you see these amazing ivory gulls. We're off the vessel at least once a day, generally speaking twice a day. Zodiacing in different conditions brings different experiences and different weather experiences too. I love it. Zodiacing in when it's very snowy like this, it can be quite challenging, but it's also very beautiful, I think, and very different, with very muted greys and muted colours. Some of these images, these next few at least, and one or two that I've shown already, are images of Brett's. Some of you will have travelled with Brett, I'm sure. Brett's in our marketing department and leads a number of trips, and is a most wonderful photographer, but some of these images are his. I know Brett was particularly partial to these little auks on one of the stops that he made when he was up there a couple of years ago. One of the things that, of course, we see a lot when we're on these trips, when we're up in this part of the world, is Arctic fox. This particular Arctic fox is half in his summer colours and half in his winter colours, but they are very charismatic animals. This one that I photographed was enjoying sledging, basically. And it did this a couple of times. It was obviously great fun. But generally speaking, you'll see them at the foot of the cliffs, the bird cliffs, and they'll be there clambering across the rocks in order to go and go and collect eggs. Very charismatic, very attractive animals, and plenty of them around, and also plenty of these, hopefully, as well. These rather unusual reindeer, Svalbard reindeer. It's a distinct subspecies. They're quite small and stocky with rather short legs, but they're very tranquil, and as long as you stay quiet, you can really get quite close to them. Brett had better luck than me on his trip. He found this lovely male with a full set of antlers. Also possible to see some very interesting waders, such as red or grey phalarope, depending on which side of the continent, which side of the Atlantic you're on. They are beautiful and reasonably common to see. For me, the birds play a very important role in the trip, as does the scenery, and particularly somewhere like Spitsbergen. It's a crucial part of the trip, and a very dramatic part of the trip. On the trip that I was on, we got almost to Fuglesången without having seen polar bears, and I was slightly worried, if I'm completely honest, but we'd seen lots of other lovely things, as I've shown you along the way. But we began to head south. We were seeing things like Arctic tern and bearded seal. And en route south, we also found a lovely walrus haul out, where there would have been 90 or 100 walruses, which was again a lovely thing to see. You can't beat walruses. They're beautiful creatures, if a little unusual, but again wonderful to see. And then we came into Hornsund, which I mentioned to you, further south, and we came into this area, and this is an area where, when I was there, at least a year or two ago, there was quite a lot of fast ice. So fast ice is important in respect of polar bears. That's ice that is attached to the land, but is moving. And as we approached Hornsund, this was what we saw in the distance. I don't know if you can see. Hopefully you can. Excuse me, your internet connection is good enough. Hopefully you can see in the bottom right hand corner, you can see a polar bear. It was incredibly exciting to see that bear in this amazing dramatic landscape. And after 2 or 3 days of not having seen polar bear, it was a very, I suppose, to be fair, it was a welcome relief. It was a very exciting sighting. And we were able to watch the bear for an extended period of time. We watched him for actually hours, and it was really wonderful. It was very, very interesting to watch him, or her. Actually, I'm not entirely sure whether it's male or female. It was bear number 17. You can see number 17 painted on its bum, where researchers are able to have relatively easy access to the bears, they will mark them in some way or another, so that they can find out what their movements are over a period of time. You'll see this guy here was actually sitting next to a hole in the ice, just waiting for a seal to pop out, and they will sit like that for hours and hours and hours on end, and it's fascinating to watch. But of course, they move around. It's lovely to see them moving around. It's lovely to see them coming out of the water. These next couple of shots are Brett's, and it's that they really are just the most wonderful mammals of all to see. Actually, on this particular trip, one of the things that amazed me most, although it was fabulous to see these polar bears, one of the things that amazed me most was actually seeing beluga whales, because they actually took me by surprise. it was quite unexpected. This was the only shot I got, and it's a rubbish shot of a beluga whale, so I do apologise for that. But it was a group of about 30, and they were fishing nearby, and they stayed around us for a while at a reasonable distance. But I found this to be a particularly wonderful and exciting encounter because it took us all by surprise. Just the last couple of shots are of the bird cliffs, because they are so important in the Arctic, with huge numbers of things like common and Brunix guillemots and little auks and all sorts of amazing things. The sound of the bird cliffs is very difficult to describe unless you've been there, unless you've seen how truly wonderful they are. And you might visit the bird cliffs on a Zodiac cruise, as in this case, or you could well do it in kayaks, and I've done both, and they are equally exciting. Obviously, Zodiacs if you want to enjoy photography, kayaks if you're less concerned about photography and just want to have that rather wonderful experience. Another shot of Brett's here of the nesting guillemots, but it really is fabulous. It's feels kind of prehistoric, I would say. So I'm a great advocate, as you can hopefully tell, of polar voyages. I think they offer an opportunity to experience some parts of our planet that simply without being on vessels you just couldn't experience. We work with Ocean Adventurer, we work with Quark, we work with Spirit of Enderby, and we work with vessels like Plancius and others. We work with a number of different vessels. This particular vessel, as I mentioned earlier, we've chartered for Festival of Wildlife which is going to be in Spitsbergen at the end of June next year, 2022. But we also have half chartered it. By that I mean we've chartered half of the berths for a trip which Mark Coordine is leading. I will also be on board, which is a trip which we're calling Frozen South, and that is Falklands, Antarctica and South Georgia. So it's a vessel that I love. It can accommodate 136 passengers. It was recently refitted 5 or 6 years ago, and it's just beautiful. It's the most fabulous ship to travel on. Leaving you really now, hopefully you may have 1 or 2 questions for me, but leaving you with a couple of Brett's photographs of polar bears from Spitsbergen, because they really are the ultimate mammal, I think, and the most wonderful thing to see on any Arctic voyage, but particularly on an Arctic voyage in Spitsbergen. So that's it from me. And Dan, you've got to wake up now and ask me something.
That was fabulous, Chris. That was absolutely brilliant. Yeah, I feel like I've been to all 3 places, to be honest. It's so it's relaxing to sit here and kind of just watch the imagery and hear you talk about it. It's such a wonderful kind of insight. So thank you for that. We've had lots of lovely comments and stuff. So really well done, mate. You're not a bad photographer, are you? You've taken some pretty good shots there.
I think it's a war of attrition, Dan. I suppose shots from Brett, although I don't think
not at all. Not at all. Chris, we have, as I mentioned, got a few questions for you. So if you don't mind, I'll get straight into those. Put you on the spot with a few of them.
Yeah, far away. I'll try and answer them.
Yeah, let's see what we can do. Okay, so Jackie has said, what is the best cure or option for seasickness, and how rough can the seas be in the respective destinations? Now I know that's quite open-ended, because obviously how long's a piece of string, but if you could perhaps give us a bit of a insight into that. Yeah,
absolutely. So so let's think. There are there's various thoughts that I have on that. Firstly, the seas in the north are much calmer than the seas in the south, in my experience, and I think others would say the same. The voyage to Spitsbergen, the voyage to Wrangel, that whole area of the Russian Far East and so on, and up into Spitsbergen, the seas are much calmer than they are traveling, for example, from the Falkland Islands out to South Georgia, or the Falkland Islands and South Georgia down to Antarctica, or traveling across the Drake Passage. Having said that, I do suffer from seasickness, and I still love it. But what I do is I use the patches. And so, although some people take seasickness tablets, or some people wear the wristbands and so on, which work on pressure points, I believe, on your wrist, the thing I have found to be absolutely the best, without question, is a thing called scopoderm. And it's a little circular patch which you put behind your ear. It looks like a little plaster, and you change it every 3 days or so, and it releases some stuff into your system that yeah, technical, actually. Clearly you can tell I'm a medical man. It releases some medicine into you, and it just does away with the seasickness. It goes. It's brilliant. They're absolutely brilliant. You get them online. It's
okay. And will they last 24 hours, or are they kind of?
It lasts 72 hours. So I'm just plugging my laptop in because I realised it was about to crash. No, that wouldn't be good at all. They last 72 hours. So you put them on 2 or 3 hours before you sail. You put it behind your ear 72 hours before you sail. Sorry, a couple of hours before you sail. Within a couple of hours, it stabilizes your system. Wow. And you'll feel fine. Famous last words. If you don't feel fine, the best thing to do is to get outside and get fresh air and look at the horizon. So even if you are wearing one of these patches, or you've taken other medication, and you're feeling a bit dodgy, or you haven't got any patches and you haven't taken any medication, get outside. But then you're not doing these voyages in order to be inside and be in your cabin. You're doing them to be out there with your binoculars, with your camera, looking at albatrosses, looking at sheer waters, looking at, I don't know, orcs and fulmars and all these amazing things, and looking for whales. And it's concentrating on things like that takes your mind off any form of seasickness.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just one of the most relaxing experiences as well, just being out on the water and just scanning the water for something, breaking the surface or whatever. It's just intoxicating, in its own way. I'm with you on that. It's
absolutely fab. I love it. Absolutely. Everything about it is brilliant.
Chris, moving on, kind of similar lines really, but we've got a question just about equipment and clothing that you might need to have. Obviously, looking at the photos and stuff, if you haven't been there, it looks absolutely perishing. Is that the truth, or is it,
It depends where. Okay, so
one of the photos you had flip-flops on, I saw.
Yeah,
I think the Wrangel photo.
You know what? That was coming straight south from Wrangel Island, and it was particularly warm. That was on the last voyage. That was 2019, and it was awful. The temperature. It was far too warm, and in actual fact, we were seeing all sorts of unusual things because it was too warm. And yeah, we were in flip-flops on deck and t-shirts, which is crazy. We shouldn't have been. We should have been wrapped up. And in previous years we've been wrapped up. Hey, look, it gets really cold. It really gets cold, and you need to be prepared. And it's all about layering, right? It's about wearing a base layer. It's about wearing a mid layer. It's about having a nice padded jacket to wear. You'll have seen we have those the red Wildlife Worldwide jackets, as you know, those nice padded jackets. And then about having an outer layer. On many of the voyages, you will be provided with that kit. Generally speaking, top half only. So bottom half you will generally have to buy yourself. So you would have to buy base layer leggings and some nice sort of fleecy lined leggings
So
to
boots
go
or-
on top, if you like. Yeah. Generally speaking, in my experience, all of the vessels provide boots. So they would generally speaking be something like probably made by Muck Boots. They'll probably be Muck Boot Arctic Sports, which are great. So you don't need to go out and buy all that kind of stuff. You generally wouldn't have to buy a jacket, but you do need to have layers. Plus, it's nice to have some of your own gear as well. And, you know, when you're inside, even though inside the vessel is lovely and warm, it's quite nice having a puffer jacket near, you know, always to hand, with your binoculars always to hand and your camera always to hand. So if you happen to be inside, you know, having a cup of coffee or a bite to eat or something, and there's a call that comes over the radio that says there's humpback whales outside, or wandering albatross, or, you know, we've just seen leopard seals, or there's a polar bear or whatever, you can just chuck your jacket on and go straight out.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. John Hall actually proposed this question and asked specifically about our Festival of Wildlife and whether the jackets are provided on that. And I think I'm right in saying that they are, aren't they?
They are.
Those yellow ones.
Jackets are provided. They're lovely, super duper warm jackets with a lovely fleecy lining, and great big thick hoods. They also provide the boots on those. The jackets we can keep, but the boots, you know, are rental boots. You know, they're lent to us. There's no cost for that. But the jackets we keep, and it's superb kit, absolutely superb kit.
No, that's brilliant. Chris, a question just on the kayaking, if you don't mind. And I don't know if you can remember, and obviously it may vary between the different vessels, but Elaine, who's a very keen kayaker, has asked, are they typically kind of open canoes, like, or open kayaks for one or two people, or are they enclosed kayaks, or is there a mixture? Or
so there's a mixture.
Yeah.
On Ocean Adventurer, there are two options. Because generally speaking, on Ocean Adventurer, there will be a kayaking program which you sign up to, which might be 4 or 5 days worth of kayaking. So you pay a little bit extra to do that, and it's brilliant, I have to say. Basically, what that means is that there might be a team, in inverted commas, perhaps of half a dozen people that have paid to do 4 or 5 days worth of kayaking. They would generally have spray decks. The sort of the skirts that therefore make the kayaks enclosed, generally be people that perhaps have got a little bit more experience of kayaking.
Okay.
You can also do sort of a morning or an afternoon, in other words, sort of a couple of hours here and there, and not without having signed up to that 4 or 5 day thing. Generally speaking, the kayaks will have the kayaks as open kayaks, so they're available to people that maybe don't have quite so much experience and wouldn't be quite so confident in a kayak that's got a skirt or a spray deck on it.
That's
You've kind of got both options.
Brilliant. That's super helpful. Thank you, Chris. Another question from John, just with regard to the walking and the landings, and how strenuous are they? I don't know if that varies between regions or
it does.
Or whether it's
It does.
Okay.
It definitely varies between regions. So there are two different types of landing. There's wet landings, where, as the name suggests, you'll get wet feet. So you'll be wearing your wellies. The water might come up ankle deep. It might come up a bit higher than that. Sometimes you get wet feet, though that's quite unlikely. And dry landings where you'll land on a beach without getting wet. The walking can be strenuous, but you will always be told in advance what to expect. So you'll be told in advance of the landing whether it's going to be a wet or dry landing, and you'll be told in advance what the activity is that you're going to be doing when you're on land. So it might be that you're going to be on land for a couple of hours, let's say, and there might be, let's say, 2 or 3 groups. There might be, so for example, on Wrangel Island, when Mark and I and Joe do the Wrangel Island trips, we might have a dry landing, and we'll say to people, look, we're going to have three different groups. I'll go with a walking group, and our intention is going to be to walk for an hour and a half or whatever, see if we can find muskox. Mark will have a wildlife photography group, perhaps doing a workshop on the beach, and maybe Joe will hike for an hour in order to find some interesting landscape that he wants to do a landscape photography workshop on. And there may be someone else taking another walk, or just generally looking around. So very varied, but you'll always know in advance.
Yeah, that's good. And the flexibility to kind of, choose the activity which works best for you, which is nice.
Yeah.
So I think we try to, well, generally they try to be as accommodating as possible, don't they, with the various fitness levels and so forth.
Yeah.
Chris, I have not launched the poll. I've just done that. I should have probably done that earlier. So I don't know if you guys can see, but there should be a poll visible to you where you can, as I say, you can select the various different trips that Chris has talked about tonight, and we can provide additional info on those. I'll leave that just going in the background whilst we continue with the questions. Ali has asked about whether they can cater for vegetarians on these vessels, on these, expedition ships.
Yeah, no problem at all. Absolutely no problem at all. Again, usual story, isn't it? It's like, as long as we know in advance, vegetarians, vegans, all kinds of
celiac,
any combination of combinations we can cater for, as long as we know in advance. And I tell you what, the food is absolutely outstanding. On Spirit of Enderby up in Wrangel Island, I reckon the food's better than on any other vessel I've ever been on. Really? It's amazing. And they're bringing, that comes up from New Zealand. Wow. Beautiful New Zealand wines, amazing New Zealand lamb, and all that kind of stuff. Probably shouldn't say that. I know there's lots of vegetarians, and I love vegetarian food, but very, very good. And
do you tend to come back a few pounds heavier, or does the cold kind of offset the additional food you're eating?
Yeah, we do. Yeah. Well, the food's great.
Yeah.
And it's all beautifully cooked. The chefs are superb. Whichever vessel you're on, it's absolutely tremendous. It really is.
Nice part of the experience, I can imagine.
Yeah, it is. It's good. I mean, that's not why you do the trip, right? But it's lovely. If you've been on the ice, or you've done a lovely Zodiac cruise or something like that, and you come back and you're cold. However many layers you've got on, the chances are you're probably feeling a bit chilly. So it's lovely to come back in and have a beautifully cooked meal. So it's super. It really is.
It sounds lovely. Chris, we have just got a question around COVID, actually. This is something which we do get asked a bit. And Liz has said, as a solo traveller, I would be sharing a cabin with a stranger. Do you have a requirement for all passengers to be fully COVID vaccinated? I think the simple answer is yes, isn't it, with all of the operators these days?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's requiring it. All of the vessel operators are requiring it. We're asking for it, aren't we, on our group departures too? And it's the right thing. Quarantine cabins and so on as well. In the unfortunate event that there was a COVID case, they all have quarantine cabins. So yes, Liz is the answer to that.
Yeah, and no, they're very kind of stringent kind of protocols and stuff in place now, aren't they, around that, with testing prior and during the voyage and everything. So no, it's very kind of reassuring to see, really. I think we're kind of getting there with the questions, Chris. There's still lots of lovely comments coming in. Diane has suggested ginger biscuits. That's the answer to seasickness. That's all you need.
The answer to anything, aren't they? If you ask Nick Jones.
Yeah, he's a big fan, isn't he? Just don't mix them with the others. Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise, they'll be all hell.
Hello, travellers. It's lots of people. I mean, it is worth mentioning that. I mean, there are lots of individuals who like to travel on these voyages, isn't there? We have experience of that. Lots of people, who might be on their own for one reason or another, wanting to know if they can share. This is moving that question slightly away from the COVID thing, but we can easily cater for single people on these voyages without you having to pay twice the cabin amount. You can share. There's often triple cabins, and there's often cabins as well for people.
There are some vessels as well that have the single cabins. I think that you're able to get those without a supplement. So
that's true.
If that is a concern, do check with us, and the guys can advise. Lots and lots more lovely comments coming in here, Chris. We've got somebody's just asked about the Falklands, and is the MOD flight to the Falklands an option for getting out to Antarctica?
Well, for getting to the Falklands, technically the answer to that is yes, it is. I mean, I've done it. And I actually thought it was brilliant. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I've done it. Yeah, it's a funny old experience, isn't it? Yeah.
It's I enjoyed it. I thought it was great. In actual fact, I mean, I would tend not to favour it because it's a much more expensive way of going than going via South America. And you know, Santiago is the most beautiful city. Buenos Aires is the most beautiful city. The flight sort of down the to sort of the bottom end of South America is lovely. You know, it's you're flying over beautiful landscape. I mean, I'm a great believer in enjoying places en route. So I'd spend a couple of nights in Santiago on the way down, or a couple of nights in Buenos Aires on the way down. Right. But we can. I mean, of course, we can do it. It's a more expensive route, and it's less reliable because you're traveling on an Air Force flight. So they do have the option to pull the flight in the event that they've got to go charging into some part of the world that
or just to bump you off as well.
Or just to bump you off. Yeah.
That has happened in the past, I'm aware of. But it wouldn't be unreasonable to suggest that flight with the MOD is probably about twice the cost that it would cost, you know,
Yeah,
it would cost to fly down via Santiago down to Punta Arenas, for example.
Spend it on good Chilean wine when you're there.
Chris, that is super. I think we're pretty much there with the questions, but if we have missed any, I do apologize. That'll be my fault, and we will get onto that in the morning. But no, it's been a really lovely talk, Chris. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Yes, thank you for joining us. And if you want to know anything more, please feel free to email me directly. You're very welcome. I'm chris@wildlifeworldwide.com, or you can email our regular sales email address and find out more info on our website.
Great stuff. Right. On that note, we'll say goodbye, shall we?
That's it. All the best. Cheerio. Thanks for joining us.
Good night, guys. Thank you ever so much. All the best.